Moscow, January 1977. Adolf Tolkachev stood in the dim hallway of his apartment building on Leninsky Prospect, fumbling with an envelope that would mark him for death. Inside were handwritten notes detailing the latest advances in Soviet aviation radar, classified materials he'd smuggled from his desk at the Moscow Aviation Institute. His hands trembled not from cold, but from a fear so profound it had become familiar. Outside, a black Volga sedan idled at the corner, exhaust clouds rising into the frigid air. KGB? Or just another bureaucrat heading home late? Tolkachev couldn't know. What he did know, with terrible clarity, was that the CIA officer he was supposed to meet had failed to appear for the third consecutive week. The Americans didn't want him. After 18 months of attempts, notes pushed through car windows, approaches at gas stations, desperate signals in public places, the greatest intelligence asset the West would ever recruit inside the Soviet military-industrial complex was still completely alone. He slipped the envelope back into his coat pocket and walked into the Moscow night, carrying secrets worth billions and a conviction that the system he served deserved to burn. 8 years later, that conviction would cost him everything. But first, it would help America win the Cold War. When Adolf Tolkachev first attempted contact with the CIA in January 1977, the agency's Moscow station had every reason to be suspicious. The previous decade had been catastrophic for American intelligence operations in the Soviet Union. The KGB had systematically rolled up CIA networks, leaving the agency nearly blind in Moscow. Every walk-in volunteer was assumed to be a KGB provocation, a dangle designed to identify CIA officers, tie up resources, or feed disinformation into American intelligence channels. Station Chief Robert Fulton read the early reports about the persistent Russian trying to make contact and saw only warning signs. "We thought he was too good to be true," recalled CIA officer Marty Peterson, one of the few case officers operating in Moscow during this period. The notes Tolkachev tried to pass contained technical details that seemed impossibly valuable. Exactly what a sophisticated KGB operation would offer as bait. Standard procedure dictated caution, surveillance detection runs, and extensive background checks before accepting any Soviet volunteer. But Tolkachev's increasingly desperate attempts created a bureaucratic paralysis. Nobody wanted to be responsible for falling into a KGB trap. The agency's institutional trauma ran deep. In 1977, the CIA was still reeling from the Year of the Spy, the devastating revelation that multiple American intelligence operations had been compromised. Moscow Station operated under the assumption that the KGB watched everything, knew everyone, and had penetrated their operations at multiple levels. The working assumption, one officer later explained, was that the KGB was 10 feet tall and bulletproof. This defensive crouch meant that genuine volunteers were often ignored or mishandled. Meanwhile, Tolkachev's motivations were anything but ambiguous to him. As a leading aviation electronics engineer at the Scientific Research Institute for Radio Engineering, he had access to the Soviet Union's most advanced fighter aircraft radar systems, the technology that would guide MiG-29s and Su-27s against American aircraft in any future conflict. But Tolkachev wasn't driven by money, ideology in the traditional sense, or personal ambition. His fury was deeply personal and unshakable. During Stalin's purges, Tolkachev's wife's parents had been arrested and executed. The trauma never healed. Tolkachev watched the Soviet system grind forward, unchanged in its essential brutality despite Khrushchev's thaw and Brezhnev's stagnation. He saw the lies, the privileges of the nomenklatura, the suffocating conformity, and the casual cruelty of the security apparatus. Most Soviet citizens adapted, accepting what they couldn't change. Tolkachev chose treason, methodical, calculated, and driven by a hatred so cold it would sustain him through 8 years of extraordinary risk. "I want to punish the Soviet system for what it did to my family," he would later explain to his CIA handlers. This wasn't a man seeking the good life in America or playing games of espionage tradecraft. This was revenge, pure and focused. The CIA would eventually recognize they had stumbled into one of the greatest intelligence windfalls in agency history, but not before nearly losing him through their own paranoia. Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev was born in 1927. Coming of age during World War II and beginning his engineering career in the early years of the Cold War. By the 1960s, he had established himself as a brilliant radar specialist, working his way into the upper tiers of Soviet military aviation research. His expertise centered on phased array radars and airborne weapons systems, the electronic eyes and brains of Soviet fighter aircraft. The Scientific Research Institute for Radio Engineering, where Tolkachev worked, was one of dozens of classified facilities comprising the Soviet defense industry's nervous system. These institutes operated in a parallel universe of special passes, internal secrecy, and privileged access to foreign technical literature. Engineers like Tolkachev enjoyed comfortable apartments, access to special stores, and the knowledge that their work mattered to the motherland's defense. For most, this was enough. For Tolkachev, it was a prison with slightly better amenities. His decision to approach the CIA crystallized in 1976. The immediate trigger remains unclear. Perhaps a particular injustice observed at work, a conversation with his wife Elena about her parents' fate, or simply the accumulated weight of decades living in a society he despised. Whatever the catalyst, Tolkachev began methodically planning how to contact American intelligence. His first attempt came in January 1977, when he pushed a note through the window of a car he believed belonged to an American diplomat. The note, written in Russian, offered information on Soviet military aviation systems and requested contact. The car belonged to an American, but not a CIA officer, a common confusion that would plague his early attempts. Similar approaches followed over the next 18 months. Notes left at gas stations frequented by American diplomats, attempts to make contact at public locations, increasingly detailed technical samples left at dead drops of his own design. The CIA's Moscow station logged these attempts and circulated his descriptions and notes to headquarters. The counterintelligence staff's assessment was damning. Likely provocation. The technical details seemed too perfect, the persistence too convenient. This was exactly how the KGB would run an operation to identify CIA officers and map their surveillance detection routes. Moscow Station had lost so many operations to KGB penetrations that accepting a volunteer offering crown jewels of Soviet military technology seemed suicidally naive. But within Langley's Soviet division, a handful of officers began to question the rejection. The technical material Tolkachev provided, even in those early samples, showed knowledge that would be difficult for the KGB to fabricate. His communications demonstrated a certain amateur quality, the operational security mistakes of a genuine volunteer rather than the carefully orchestrated tradecraft of a professional intelligence service. Most compellingly, the KGB's standard provocation tactics involved quick hooks and aggressive compromise attempts. Tolkachev's patient, persistent approach over 18 months suggested either the longest-running KGB game ever attempted or a genuinely desperate Soviet citizen. Finally, in December 1978, the CIA decided to take the risk. A new case officer arrived in Moscow with specific instructions. Make contact with the persistent Soviet engineer, assess his authenticity, and if genuine, establish a secure, operational relationship. The officer selected for this crucial task was John Gilsher, a Russian-speaking case officer with experience running assets in hostile environments. The meeting protocol was necessarily elaborate. Tolkachev was instructed through a carefully orchestrated signal system to appear at a specific location where Gilshire could approach without immediate KGB observation. On January 11, 1979, exactly 2 years after Tolkachev's first approach, the two men made contact inside a Moscow apartment building stairwell. "I am ready to provide everything I can access," Tolkachev told Gilshire in rapid Russian. "I want no money now. I want this system punished." Gilshire, trained to spot deception and provocation, saw only genuine determination. The CIA had just recruited the greatest Soviet military intelligence source in American history. The operational relationship that developed between Adolf Tolkachev and the CIA between 1979 and 1985 revolutionized American understanding of Soviet military aviation, while demonstrating the extraordinary risks both sides accepted in the intelligence war's most dangerous arena. The first year, building trust and tradecraft. Tolkachev's initial debriefings in 1979 shocked his CIA handlers. He had access not just to his own institute's research, but to cross-institutional technical libraries, where Soviet aviation research was shared among cleared personnel. This meant he could photograph not only his own work on radar systems, but also documentation on aircraft design, weapons integration, electronic countermeasures, and tactical doctrine. The breadth of material was unprecedented, but operating in Moscow presented challenges unlike anywhere else in the world. The KGB's 7th Directorate maintained blanket surveillance on all Western diplomats and suspected intelligence officers. Every CIA officer in Moscow operated under the assumption they were being watched, their cars tracked, their apartments bugged, their contacts noted. Traditional espionage tradecraft, brush passes, dead drops, surveillance detection routes, became elaborate chess games against the KGB's overwhelming numerical advantage. CIA technical specialists designed specialized equipment for Tolkachev's use. A modified Pentax camera with extremely fast film allowed him to photograph documents quickly in low-light conditions. A small Tropple subminiature camera, about the size of a cigarette pack, could be concealed in clothing for emergency photography. The agency provided one-time pads for coded communications and precisely engineered dead drop concealment devices, fake rocks, tree stumps with hidden compartments, magnetic containers that could be attached under Moscow park benches. The communication plan established a regular rhythm. Tolkachev would signal his readiness to meet by marking a specific location, a lamppost on Kutuzovsky Prospect smeared with chalk at a precise point. CIA officers would confirm the meeting with a counter-signal. The actual meetings took place in stairwells, underground garages, or briefly inside cars that would pick up Tolkachev while he walked through specific Moscow neighborhoods. These personal meetings were extraordinarily dangerous. "Every time we did it," one CIA officer recalled, "we knew that if the KGB was following, we'd all end up in Lubyanka." The meetings were necessarily brief, 10 to 15 minutes maximum. Tolkachev would hand over rolls of exposed film containing hundreds of photographed documents. His handlers would pass him new film, money, which he consistently refused until late in the operation, and any technical questions from agency analysts. The intelligence windfall, 1980-1983. Between 1980 and 1983, Tolkachev provided over 150 rolls of film containing more than 5,000 pages of highly classified Soviet military technical documents. The material covered radar systems, complete technical specifications for the NO-19 radar, planned for the MiG-29 and the No-193 radar for the Su-27. These were the Soviet Union's next-generation fighters designed to counter American F-15s and F-16s. Tolkachev provided range capabilities, frequency characteristics, processing speeds, and crucially, vulnerability analyses. Electronic countermeasures. Soviet research on jamming American radar systems and hardening their own systems against American electronic warfare. This was a technological arms race within the broader Cold War, and Tolkachev gave the Americans the Soviet playbook. Weapons integration. How Soviet aircraft combined radar targeting with missile systems, including the R-27 and R-73 air-to-air missiles. Understanding these integration systems allowed American engineers to design countermeasures. Tactical doctrine. Operational manuals describing how Soviet pilots would actually employ these systems in combat. Engagement ranges, tactics for fighting Western aircraft, coordination with ground-based air defense. The impact on American military planning was immediate and profound. Tolkachev's information allowed us to design our aircraft and electronic warfare systems with precise knowledge of what they'd face, explained one Pentagon analyst years later. The billions spent on American fighter development and electronic warfare systems were directed by intelligence Tolkachev provided from his desk in Moscow. Air Force Colonel Raymond Pollack, who managed the exploitation of Tolkachev's material, called him the most valuable spy America ever had inside the Soviet Union. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger received regular briefings on Tolkachev's intelligence. President Reagan was personally informed of the general nature of the intelligence windfall, though not Tolkachev's specific identity. The near misses, KGB surveillance, and close calls. Operating at this level of productivity couldn't continue indefinitely without increasing risk. Multiple times between 1980 and 1984, CIA Tolkachev meetings came dangerously close to KGB surveillance. In June 1982, a routine meeting nearly ended in disaster when KGB surveillance teams happened upon the area where Case Officer Mike, David Rolfe, was scheduled to meet Tolkachev. The meeting was aborted at the last second through Moscow Station's sophisticated early warning system, CIA officers maintaining overwatch positions who could signal danger. Tolkachev walked past the planned meeting point without stopping, the abort signal received just in time. Another close call came in March 1983. Tolkachev signaled for a meeting, but arrived at the designated location clearly shaken. "I think I was followed yesterday," he told his handler. "Someone in my institute asked unusual questions about my work schedule." This triggered an immediate stand-down. No meetings for 3 months while the CIA assessed whether Tolkachev had drawn suspicion. The assessment concluded he was likely paranoid rather than actually under investigation. But the caution reflected how fragile the operation remained. The operational strain affected everyone involved. Tolkachev spent his days living a double life of extraordinary discipline. At work, he was the model Soviet engineer, punctual, productive, politically reliable. He attended Communist Party meetings, participated in socialist labor competitions, and maintained his security clearance through regular background checks. At night, in his apartment, he photographed classified documents 1 page at a time, using a homemade copy stand to keep the camera steady. His CIA handlers in Moscow rotated through assignments, each managing the enormous stress of running the agency's most valuable Soviet source, while under constant KGB surveillance. "You never really slept soundly," one recalled. "Every time the phone rang at night, you wondered if this was it, if Tolkachev had been arrested and they were coming for you next." The psychology of betrayal. What kept Tolkachev going through 8 years of this stress was the very hatred that drove him to treason initially. In conversations with his handlers, he showed no moral ambiguity about what he was doing. "I am not betraying my country," he explained during one meeting. "I am betraying the system that betrayed my country." This distinction was crucial to his self-conception. He saw himself as a Russian patriot acting against a corrupt regime that had killed millions of its own citizens. The CIA tried multiple times to prepare Tolkachev for exfiltration from the Soviet Union. The agency offered to extract him, his wife Elena, and their son. Tolkachev consistently refused. "I'm not finished," he would say. "There's more damage I can do to them." This determination impressed and worried his handlers in equal measure. At some level, Tolkachev seemed to accept that his operation would eventually be discovered, and that discovery would mean death. He appeared willing to accept that price as long as he inflicted maximum damage on the Soviet system first. This psychological profile made Tolkachev extraordinarily productive, but also difficult to protect. Normal asset management assumes the source wants to survive, wants the operation to continue safely, will accept restrictions for security reasons. Tolkachev's death wish, sublimated into intelligence collection but unmistakably present, meant he sometimes took risks the CIA couldn't control. He photographed more documents than requested, stayed at work late to access files, and pushed for more frequent meetings than security warranted. American exploitation, military and technical intelligence. The Tolkachev intelligence fundamentally altered American military aviation development through the 1980s. At Tactical Air Command, fighter tacticians used his information to write new engagement doctrines for fighting Soviet aircraft. They now knew that the MiG-29's radar had a limited look-down capability, meaning American fighters could exploit low-altitude attack profiles. They understood the specific radar frequencies used by Soviet systems, allowing American electronic warfare specialists to design precise jamming equipment. The F-15 and F-16 programs incorporated design changes based on Tolkachev's intelligence. The ALQ-165 airborne self-protection jammer, installed on American tactical aircraft, was engineered with precise knowledge of Soviet radar characteristics Tolkachev provided. The Pentagon's Joint Electronic Warfare Center established a special classified program to exploit his material, with access restricted to officials holding special compartmented clearances beyond normal top secret. Hughes Aircraft, Raytheon, and other defense contractors received sanitized versions of Tolkachev's intelligence to guide their radar and electronic warfare system development. They didn't know the source, but they knew the information was extraordinarily reliable. "We could test our systems against exact simulations of Soviet radars," explained one Hughes engineer years later. That kind of precision was unprecedented. The intelligence also provided strategic reassurance during a period of intense Cold War tension. The early Reagan administration had entered office convinced that the United States faced a window of vulnerability, a period where Soviet military advantages might tempt them toward aggression. Tolkachev's reporting showed that Soviet technology, while formidable, wasn't as advanced as worst-case intelligence estimates had suggested. This allowed for more confident American military planning and arguably reduced the chance of miscalculation during the tense early 1980s. Soviet security, the system that worked until it didn't. Meanwhile, the KGB's second chief directorate, responsible for counterintelligence inside the Soviet Union, continued its work completely unaware that the CIA was receiving detailed technical documentation from inside their military-industrial complex. This wasn't from lack of vigilance. The Soviet security system included multiple redundant safeguards. All personnel with access to classified materials underwent regular background checks. Their personal lives were monitored. Financial irregularities, ideological doubts, foreign contacts, all could trigger investigation. Research institutes employed security officers who tracked document access, noting who viewed what files and when. Classified materials were counted at the end of each workday. Random polygraph examinations were conducted on personnel with access to the most sensitive programs. Tolkachev successfully navigated all of this through careful preparation and the advantages of being a model Soviet citizen. He had no foreign contacts except his authorized interactions with technical literature from the West, carefully controlled and monitored, but part of his job. He displayed no unusual financial situation. He lived simply and accepted CIA payments only reluctantly, leaving them largely unspent. His wife Elena knew nothing of his espionage. He compartmented this part of his life completely. To colleagues and security officials, Adolf Tolkachev appeared to be exactly what he claimed: a dedicated Soviet engineer contributing to the motherland's defense. The KGB did investigate several security incidents at Tolkachev's institute during this period, but none pointed to him. A 1981 review of document access procedures found minor irregularities, but attributed them to bureaucratic sloppiness rather than espionage. Had the KGB known what to look for? Specifically, that someone was systematically photographing documents, they might have caught him. But without that predicate knowledge, his activity blended into the normal rhythm of a busy research institute. The rot from within, the CIA betrayals. What the KGB's internal security couldn't detect. Betrayal from inside the CIA delivered directly to them. The destruction of Adolf Tolkachev came not from his own mistakes or Soviet counterintelligence skill, but from traitors inside American intelligence. In 1980, Edward Lee Howard was hired by the CIA and trained for Moscow Station assignment. During his training, Howard was briefed on highly sensitive Soviet operations, including general information about Tolkachev's case. Before Howard could deploy to Moscow, however, the CIA discovered his drug use and dismissed him. Bitter and financially desperate, Howard contacted the KGB in 1984 and began selling American secrets. Simultaneously, Aldrich Ames, a CIA counterintelligence officer with access to the complete registry of Soviet sources, was also preparing to betray his country. Ames's motivations were purely mercenary. He needed money to support his lifestyle and saw the KGB as willing to pay handsomely. In April 1985, Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and handed over information identifying every major CIA asset inside the Soviet Union. The KGB now had multiple sources pointing to the same conclusion. The CIA had an extraordinarily productive source inside the Soviet aviation industry. Even without Tolkachev's specific identity, this information allowed the KGB to narrow their search dramatically. They began reviewing access records at military research institutes, focusing on personnel who had access to the types of material the CIA was clearly receiving. Tolkachev's final months, spring 1985. The CIA suspected nothing initially. Through early 1985, meetings with Tolkachev continued on schedule. But in April 1985, he failed to appear for a planned meeting. Then he missed the backup meeting date. Moscow Station sent signals asking for confirmation he was safe. No response came. Inside the Lubyanka, the KGB's investigation had finally identified Tolkachev. Records showed he had accessed an unusually wide range of technical documentation over the previous years, more than his specific job required. When investigators discreetly searched his apartment during a day when both he and his wife were at work, they found the camera equipment hidden behind false panels in his closet. On June 13, 1985, Adolf Tolkachev was arrested as he left his apartment building for work. KGB officers seized him on the street, bundled him into a car, and drove directly to Lefortovo prison. The arrest was conducted with precision to prevent any possibility of the CIA learning what had happened and extracting other compromised sources. The investigation and trial. The KGB investigation of Tolkachev proceeded with the methodical thoroughness Soviet counterintelligence brought to major spy cases. Interrogators spent months extracting every detail of his operation, every meeting with CIA handlers, every document photographed, every piece of equipment provided. They wanted to understand not just what he'd done, but how the CIA had managed to operate successfully in Moscow for so long. Tolkachev, facing certain execution, cooperated fully. Not to save himself, he knew that was impossible, but perhaps from the same hatred that had motivated his betrayal. He gave the KGB a comprehensive account of CIA operational methods, which Soviet counterintelligence used to improve their surveillance and penetration of the American intelligence presence in Moscow. The trial was held in secret in September 1986. Soviet military courts operated differently from civilian proceedings. No public observers, no press coverage, just judges, prosecutors, and the defendant. The evidence was overwhelming, compiled in folders that detailed exactly what Tolkachev had provided to the Americans and what military advantage it had given the West. The verdict came quickly. Guilty of high treason under Article 64 of the Soviet Criminal Code. The sentence was equally predictable: death by execution. On October 24, 1986, Adolf Tolkachev was taken to a basement room in Lubyanka prison and shot in the back of the head, the standard Soviet method of execution. His body was cremated and the ashes dumped in an unmarked location. His wife Elena, who had known nothing of his espionage, was allowed to continue her life but lived under KGB surveillance for the remainder of the Soviet Union's existence. The damage assessment: what America gained. The full scope of Tolkachev's contribution to American military intelligence remained classified for decades, but post-Cold War assessments revealed the extraordinary impact. CIA Director William Casey called Tolkachev one of the most productive and valuable agents in CIA history. The technical intelligence he provided saved the United States an estimated $2 billion in research and development costs by revealing exactly what Soviet systems could and couldn't do. American engineers didn't need to design for worst-case scenarios. They knew the actual capabilities. Provided complete technical specifications for Soviet fourth-generation fighter aircraft years before those aircraft became operational. This gave American designers a 5 to 7 year advantage in developing countermeasures and superior systems. Revealed specific vulnerabilities in Soviet radar and electronic warfare systems that American tactical aircraft exploited through the 1990s and beyond. Even after the Cold War ended, this intelligence proved valuable during post-Soviet conflicts. Enabled the United States to accurately assess Soviet military aviation capabilities during crucial arms control negotiations, particularly the INF Treaty and START negotiations in the mid-1980s. American negotiators knew precisely what Soviet systems could do, preventing Soviet bluffing or exaggeration. The counterintelligence disaster. But Tolkachev's arrest was only the beginning of a catastrophic period for American intelligence. The betrayals by Edward Lee Howard and Aldrich Ames ultimately compromised over 100 intelligence operations and led to the execution of at least 10 CIA sources inside the Soviet Union. General Dmitry Polyakov, a Soviet military intelligence officer who had spied for the CIA for nearly 20 years, was arrested, tried, and executed. Valery Martinov and Sergei Motorin, KGB officers working for the CIA, were also arrested and killed. The CIA's Soviet operations were effectively destroyed. Moscow Station, once running multiple valuable sources, was left with almost nothing. It would take years to rebuild intelligence collection capabilities inside Russia. The agency launched a mole hunt that would consume enormous resources and ultimately identify Ames in 1994, 9 years after he began his betrayal. For the CIA officers who had handled Tolkachev, his arrest and execution were both professional disaster and personal tragedy. "We failed him," one said years later. "He trusted us to protect him, and we couldn't do it. Not because he made mistakes, but because we had traitors in our own ranks." The counterintelligence failures that led to Tolkachev's death triggered a comprehensive review of CIA security procedures and internal monitoring that continues to shape agency operations today. Soviet aftermath. Systemic implications. For the Soviet system, Tolkachev's betrayal revealed uncomfortable truths about the sustainability of their security model. He had operated successfully for 8 years inside their most sensitive defense institutions. The KGB's elaborate security system had failed to detect him until the CIA's own traitors revealed his existence. This suggested that other spies might be operating undetected, a paranoia that would intensify during the final years of the Soviet Union. The case also highlighted the ideological brittleness of the Soviet system by the 1980s. Tolkachev hadn't been recruited by elaborate CIA operations or compromised through personal weakness. He had volunteered, driven by genuine hatred of the regime. How many other Soviet citizens, even those with access to the system's innermost secrets, felt similar hatred, but simply never acted on it? The question haunted Soviet leadership during the glasnost period that followed, as more and more citizens openly expressed disillusionment. Adolf Tolkachev's story illuminates the Cold War's fundamental paradox. Individuals mattered enormously, even as vast, impersonal forces shaped the conflict. One man's decision to commit treason, driven by personal grief and political conviction, provided intelligence that altered military balances between superpowers. Yet that same man's fate was sealed by different individuals' betrayals inside the very organization he served. The intelligence Tolkachev provided helped America maintain military technological superiority during the Cold War's final decade. The F-15s and F-16s that dominated the 1991 Gulf War carried electronic warfare systems designed using his intelligence. American fighter pilots, who never knew his name, benefited from tactical doctrines informed by his revelations about Soviet capabilities. In this sense, Tolkachev helped America win the Cold War, though he died before seeing that victory. His story also reveals the moral ambiguity embedded in espionage. By the standards of Soviet law, Tolkachev was unquestionably a traitor who deserved punishment. By the standards of universal human rights, he was a man striking back against a system that had murdered millions, including members of his own family. The CIA officers who ran him genuinely admired his courage while using him to advance American interests. Was he a hero, a traitor, or simply a victim of historical forces larger than any individual? Post-Cold War revelations from Soviet archives confirmed that Tolkachev's intelligence was as valuable as the CIA believed. The damage assessments compiled by the KGB after his arrest showed that he had compromised virtually every major Soviet military aviation program of the 1980s. Soviet engineers had to redesign systems, alter frequencies, and modify tactics, all while knowing the Americans understood their previous approaches completely. For the CIA, Tolkachev's case remains a defining example of both intelligence success and counterintelligence failure. Every CIA officer learns about the operation during training, about the courage of a Soviet source willing to risk everything, about the meticulous tradecraft required to operate in Moscow, and about the devastating consequences when internal security fails. His photograph hangs in the CIA's Memorial Wall of Stars, one star among many representing officers and assets who died in service to American intelligence. The fundamental lesson transcends Cold War specifics. Intelligence operations depend on trust. Sources must trust that their handling agency will protect them. Adolf Tolkachev trusted the CIA with his life. The agency failed that trust not through operational incompetence, but through the betrayals of Ames and Howard. That failure haunts American intelligence to this day and drives continuing efforts to prevent similar penetrations. Standing in that Moscow hallway in January 1977, envelope of secrets clutched in his trembling hand, Adolf Tolkachev couldn't have known he would become one of history's most valuable intelligence sources. He only knew he wanted to strike back against the system that had destroyed his family. 8 years later, he had succeeded beyond any reasonable measure and paid the ultimate price for that success. His life, betrayal, and death encapsulate the human cost of the Cold War's intelligence battles. Individual courage, institutional failure, and the permanent consequences of choosing to betray one's country for what one believes is a higher cause.